From the Homestead Studios in Santa Clarita, California, it's Just the Tip-Sters with Melissa Morgan.
Yours until further notice.
Today with special guest Boone County, Kentucky Sheriff's Detective Coy Cox to discuss updates on the 10th anniversary of the Bill and Peggy Stevenson murder investigation. Remember, if you've got a tip for Melissa on anything, tell us about it by calling the Tipster hotline at 832-TIPSTER. That's 832-847-7837, or send an email to jttipsters@gmail.com. You just might hear your tip on the podcast. And now here's your host, losing sleep for days because she's obsessed with this case, but mostly because her husband snores like a low-speed jackhammer, Melissa Morgan.
More cowbell. That is a very apt description.
Low-speed jackhammer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's,
Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, dear.
That's my man.
Yeah.
That's my snoring man.
Oh, man.
You're, I always say if I were asleep, I wouldn't know that you're snoring, right? So
that would make sense.
Yeah. And you actually, I will be honest, I don't think you snored a lot last night. The night before, it was pretty intense. I think you were tired, and I was tired, and I think you didn't snore so much.
Okay, yeah, I was out last night. So were you. We both were.
Yeah, I was out a little later, but I was out.
Yeah.
I mean, you were up later, and then you came to bed, but anyway. So yeah, we
Well, part of it was because the night before I was snoring loudly, and you were obsessed about this case.
Well, yeah, I knew we were interviewing Detective Cox, and before that, I got, we've been working on this for a couple of weeks because this anniversary you never want to happen is happening today. The 10-year anniversary of the murder of Bill and Peggy Stevenson in Florence, Kentucky. And it's Memorial Day weekend. It was Memorial Day weekend then. And it's just, I can't believe it's been 10 years. And, I wasn't even aware of it for 10 years, but I can't believe it's gone on this long, something that's so odd and bizarre and unique and unprecedented. Actually, Detective Cox said the FBI classified it as one of their 1%ers because it is so.
Oh, yeah. That would make sense. It's a strange case.
It's unusual in every way, from the victims to what happened, to all of it is just extremely unique. I'll say that. And one local station, I'm a little shocked that all of them in Cincinnati haven't covered the case, but one covered the case that they got in early on Thursday. And they said that the interview with Detective Cox, you would only hear there on their station. And I was like, well, that's very interesting to me. But, there's a 3-hour time difference between where we live and where this is. And I don't even know how many messages from people. Have you seen this? Have you seen this? Have you seen this? So it came out, I guess, in the evening on Thursday evening, and on Friday morning at, 2:30 a.m. I'm getting messages at 3 a.m., at 3:30. I'm like, I got it.
It's the old thing. It's, it's 5. It's not, what is that, 3 hours? It's 5:30 or 6 in the morning. In Kentucky, people are getting up going to work, and they forget that we're in California. Yeah. It's like that old joke about your grandmother.
Yeah, my grandma never did quite get it. After I moved here, she would call me at, 5 a.m. and I'd be like, Grandma, it's 5 a.m. Well, it's 8 o'clock here. I know, but it's 5 o'clock here. But it's 8 o'clock here. Right. Yep, thanks, Grandma. It never quite gelled. So yeah, and it isn't people, I don't think, forgetting. I think it's that they were so enthused that there was more information coming out. It is
right. We've got good tipsters out there.
Yes, we have amazing people who listen to this podcast, who are so good to me and who listen closely to the podcast and who pay attention to the cases and who send me information when they get it before I do at 3 a.m. because I'll be sleeping, hopefully. But so I got quite a few messages, and there is new information. And I don't want to like pat myself too hard on the back, but I do know that a lot more information started coming out last fall after the podcast.
You could pat yourself on the back a little bit for that.
Well, it wasn't from me. I didn't call it in or email it in, but they got 3 very viable tips after the podcast aired, which is really all you can hope for, is that people do what you ask, which is for them to be aware and maybe comb through their memory banks and maybe they heard something. I do have to say May is Mental Health Month, and I get it. We're at the end of May, and I really don't care that it's Mental Health Month. I think every month should be Mental Health Month, and I think all of us have gone through a lot over the last year and a half with the pandemic, and I think a lot of mental health issues have probably come to the surface quicker than they would have otherwise. But I was fascinated by an article in Psychology Today by Catherine Ramsland, who is a forensic psychologist. You probably have heard of her if you at all follow any of these true crime cases. She has written over 60 books, and she is a professor of forensic psychology at DeSales University. And she is a straight-shooting, thoughtful, intelligent, passionate human, and I respect her greatly. And in this article, she talks about her thoughts after watching the Netflix series about the Cecil Hotel, about the case of Alyssa Lamb. And I will tell you that if you haven't seen it, it's aggravating to the point of, I want to throw things at our television, but I don't want to hurt our television. But a group of cyber sleuths, not even going to call them that, but I don't even know what to call them, saw the video of Alyssa Lamb and jumped to conclusions that, she was stalked and haunted, and, she had severe mental health issues. She was on medication and seeing specialists, and occasionally would not take her medicine. And when she did not, things like what happened, and she ended up not surviving, being found in a water tank on top of the hotel. And it's pretty clear that was of her own doing. She wasn't in her right mind. I don't believe anyone did this to her. The thing that was so interesting that Dr. Ramsland brings up is something called the conception of cognitive vulnerability, and WYSIATI, which is what you see is all there is. And that's not the truth. And especially in this case with Bill and Peggy, what you see isn't all that there is. There's a lot more underneath. And I know that there is more than one person who knows something about this case, whether they realize it now or not. If they don't realize it, I hope they come to the realization. But it's important. Apparently, one of the tips led to something very important, the collection of DNA from someone. So I think that cases like this, especially where what you see is not all that there is, and all of us can sit in our armchairs and, be would-be sleuths and think that something is very easy to solve. But we're here 10 years later with not one police agency, but many police agencies working on this, contributing and helping in ways that they can. And what they need now is help from you. They need help from the Tip-Sters. You've already helped more than you know, and I just want to thank you for that. But I know there's more we can do, and I know there's more people out there who know something. And we will leave the numbers to get a hold of the Boone County Sheriff's Office and Detective Cox at the end of the podcast. And know that you can always email us at jttipsters@gmail.com. You can call us on our Tipster hotline at 832-847-7837. And you can call and leave us ideas for cases you'd like us to cover, or any tips that you may have about this case or any other. And I don't care how small it is. I hope that you'll find something inside yourself that will propel you to call and explain your tip that you might think is nothing that could be really a big something and bring some peace to the Stevenson family. And here is our interview with Detective Coy Cox on the 10-year anniversary of the murder of Bill and Peggy Stevenson. I'm very grateful that we have Detective Coy Cox with us today, and it's a anniversary none of us ever want to talk about or have again, a 10-year anniversary. But before we speak with Detective Cox, I want to say thank you to Sheriff Michael Helmig for always being so open with allowing the detectives to talk about the case, even with people like me, which is a big deal because of where I'm from, and this case is so important. And something that Major Tom Sheben said that Michael Helmig said, Sheriff Helmig understands homicide makes a community acutely aware of trauma and loss from within. It's not an act that simply stays between the immediate parties involved. And no truer words have been said. And I know that Sergeant Tim Adams and his partner, Detective Coy Cox, have been working on this case from day one for over 10 years. And I know that Detective Cox has over 30 years in law enforcement. He's been a staff instructor, a SWAT officer, and the last 18 years or more have been with the Boone County Sheriff's Office. And he and Detective Adams were some of the first detectives on the Stevenson case, which is kind of rare. And you can hear more about the detective and a little bit more about this case in our episode 147. But some new information has come out, and we felt it was important to update the case. Here we are 10 years later. And I know that Detective Cox will never call it a cold case because it's never gone cold, and it's presently an unsolved case. And I know over the last 9 or 10 months since we spoke with Detective Cox, I have gotten a plethora of odd information, emails, and tips that I passed on, and I can't imagine some of the ones that Detective Cox has gotten, and we're going to talk about those. Thank you for being here today, Detective Cox.
Thank you for having me. Again, I think it's awesome that you get this out and keep it fresh in people's minds. Again, you've said it's the 10th anniversary, and trust me, I've heard that from the sheriff and from the family members, and we are all acutely aware of that. And I think it's really important to keep it out there. To your point, in the last 9 to 10 months, we have received what we call 3 really viable pieces of information that had just kind of been dormant for all of this time, and people have called in as a result of the podcast and other media exposure. So thank you for having me, and thank you for getting it out there, and thank you for putting this together on the 10th anniversary.
So for those who are unfamiliar with the case, I'm not sure where you've been, and especially if you are in the tri-state area in Northern Kentucky and Cincinnati or in Indiana. It is a very big case, and I will tell you that after more information has come out, people from all over have emailed me. I cannot imagine the type of information that Detective Cox gets. And at the end of this podcast, we will absolutely be giving you ways to get in touch with him, because as is always said, and I know that Sheriff Helmig said too, please, any information you think you have, let law enforcement know, and we'll give you all the ways to get in touch with them, because you don't know what that could do. You don't know what that piece of the puzzle could do. So an overview is that 10 years ago, May 29th of 2011, Detective Cox was working on a special project for the federal government, and he got a phone call. And he shows up at a condo in Oak Brook in Florence, Kentucky. And I'll let you go from there, because I'm sure in your many years in law enforcement, you've seen some real interesting stuff, but it sounds like this may be one of the most odd cases you've ever had.
Yes, and that is kind of putting it mildly, but on May 29th, we did get that call, and we arrived at the residence where Bill and Peggy Stevenson lived, and the scene was quite different than any other scene that I've ever been on, and different than any scene that most had been on. The FBI has kind of labeled it as one of those 1% cases. So, yes, it was very different. It was brutal. It was horrific, all of the things that you can imagine, but the things that kind of make it really complex is that the person or persons who were involved stayed in the crime scene for hours after the murders post-mortem and had changed things in each and every room. So the scene that we had when we got there was the scene that they wanted us to find and to experience and try to interpret, and it was not the actual crime scene that had happened. So obviously you did have the bodies there, and you had some obvious means that were used to cause the death of both Bill and Peggy Stevenson. But all of the other things that were at the scene were really just there to kind of confuse the detectives and all of those who would take part in the investigation over the last 10 years, which has included the FBI, Kentucky State Police, other detectives in the area, the VDOC Society. The list is long.
Yes.
And we have done our best to include any agency or entity that we believe could help solve the case, and that's where we are and how we feel about it.
Well,
I can tell you that we don't care who solves the case. We just care that someone solves the case. So if someone's out there and they know information, whether they're in law enforcement or outside of law enforcement, that can help us solve this case, we not only embrace that and want that, but we plead with you to help. This is a case that obviously all murders need to be solved, but this is one that has really kind of hit our community pretty hard over the last 10 years.
It definitely has, and I have gotten so many messages from people. I lived there for the first 27 years of my life, and I had moved when this case had happened, but I've gotten so many messages from all different ways of communication. People that are like, "Hey, this is still bothering me. Hey, this still is unsolved. Hey," and I'm like, "Yeah, I understand. This is something that I think is." When you said the FBI labeled it one of their 1% cases, that's pretty unprecedented. But it's one of the things I admire most about Sheriff Helmig and about your team with the Boone County Sheriff's Department is that you are open to all sort of crowdsourcing, whether it's media or other entities and agencies. It's amazing. Anything I would suggest, you're like, did it. I mean, I was like, oh, the VDOC Society. And you're like, did it, presented this case, still in touch with them. And I'm like, oh, private lab in Texas, got them on speed dial. There's absolutely nothing, I can say that you haven't already, looked into, but that doesn't mean, that's just me here. That doesn't mean that there isn't some piece of information that someone else has that they need to share. And I know that you're always open to that. You take information from every place, and you don't judge it. You act on it. You're like, well, this may not be what I think it is or where I need to go, but I'm still going to look, because you don't know where it's going to lead you. And you investigate everything until there's nothing left of it. You obliterate it. It's one of the things I admire most about you and your team. There's nothing I have said that you haven't thought of or done, which is kind of amazing. And you have some great people working on it. I know you're still in touch with people from VDOC, and I know you've investigated things like the Wiccan community, and was this a satanic act, and is it family, is it a neighbor? I mean, and two things in my mind that stood out that have to be so difficult for someone in law enforcement is someone like Bill Stevenson, who is so gregarious and open and outgoing, and has such a wide circle. Not only the oldest of like 12 kids or something, he's, got his own children and grandchildren and nieces and nephews, and he operates a truckers' chapel so that, truckers are on the road, and if they can't go to their home church, have a place to go. That's a huge number of people going in and out not just daily, but hourly. I mean, and then there's not much worse than having a family member who decides to be a jackass and kills someone else less than a year later. If there's anything to mess up an investigation and make it more difficult, it's a wide number of people to investigate and a family member who is a monster. So let's start with, where did you start? You started with, let's start with his circle and work out.
Well, you know, the first thing you do, you want to see the scene. The scene will talk to you. Again, this one was different because we had to realize that, okay, so what things in the scene actually had to do with the murders and what had to do with just somebody creating a situation that they wanted to confuse us. So obviously you start looking at who called, who last talked to them, who did they do supper with last, what kind of social gatherings had they been to recently. So you start putting those things together, interviewing those folks, go from there. And with this case, that's what made it so difficult. Usually those, not usually, always those folks would be, oh yeah, I was with Bill and Peggy Thursday night and we had a great supper, and when we left, we'd already planned the next time, and I just love spending time with them. So that's kind of what you got in this case. And from top to bottom, everyone that we have interviewed since then, and especially at that time, you know, they were just like, it was a great relationship. Bill and Peggy are awesome people. They're first ones to help. Sometimes even when you don't even know that they knew about a situation that might be going on in my life, they just, you know, came alongside and helped us. And so that part was kind of difficult. So when we started processing the evidence, you know, we had hopes to find things that would help us. It was a very clean scene that was that had been a very active scene with the crime, with 2 murders happening, each murder in different rooms. So you would kind of think, wow, you have a whole lot to process here as far as evidence-wise, and actually photographing was probably the most tedious thing that we did, because otherwise it was clean. There wasn't a lot of evidence left that could be processed in the way of fingerprints or DNA or shoe prints or those kind of things. So it was kind of limited. We sent things to the lab, and the one thing that we do have in the case that we hope will net us some, you know, great things down the road is a DNA profile of an unknown person. And we believe that belongs to our killer or one of the participants in the scene.
That's something I can't wait to get to. Yeah, that's the newest piece of information that has come out. But back to their circle, you know, their daughter Beth said they were just open and friendly with everyone and they've never met a stranger. So it had to be, you know, difficult to go through this large, you know, potential suspect pool, but also it had to be something you could vet quickly, because there had to be a very small number of people, if anyone, who would have some sort of problem with Bill and Peggy. They just, I just can't find any human being that knew them that had anything other than glowing things to say. I think I emailed you this last week. I got an email a few days ago from a guy I went to elementary school with. And he said, my daughter told me I needed to listen to your podcast. I went to church with Bill and Peggy, and they're the best people I've ever known. And I was like, this is amazing to me that there isn't, it's not like, you know, well, they put up a good face, but they were, you know, really evil behind the scenes. There isn't one person who says anything bad about them, just the most, and not flashy gracious. They're just gracious human beings. It's not like they were putting a big face out in public, like, look how good I am. As you mentioned, they would do things quietly with wanting no attention or praise. So it makes this case even more troubling and puzzling. And when you say things like the killer or killers want to leave a message, who was the message for?
Well, that's part of the question, I guess. Understanding the message would lead to some understanding of who the message was for. But so at the end of the day, it is hard as a detective who has been on several murder scenes and also, collaborated with other homicide detectives and folks just who have analyzed scenes, to look at this one and not say, don't get caught up in what you see. What is this murder all about, these murders? And at the end of the day, when all of the dust settles, there's one thing that stands out completely. Number one, someone chose this time of the day. And if you look at that, and what does that mean? So we know that it happened in the early AM hours on Sunday morning in the cover of darkness. So anyone who would come into that residence would know that at that time, in the early AM hours in the morning versus the early afternoon hours in PM, the AM hours, they're going to run into both Bill and Peggy in the residence.
Right.
The chance of that is almost 100%. Bill and Peggy, if they went out of town, they went together. If they did something other than Bill's ministries in the daytime, they were always together. So that means that they came there, they planned it at that time period, and that both Bill and Peggy had to die. Both were murdered, and as a result, there's some things that if you are in law enforcement or probably watched enough crime shows, you realize that why would both people have to die? And I'll let your minds and your listeners' minds go there. But so that tells us a few things as investigators, and there's certainly a group that you would want to look at very close and vet all of that information and where that might lead you. So when you look at the crime scene, you really have to be careful not to get caught up in everything that was going on in there and trying to analyze what this means or what that means, even though we did that. And we spent a lot of time doing that. And we have spoken with professionals in all of those expertise in those fields. So, but at the end of the day, that's the one most glaring thing, that someone chose that time of the day. They chose that night when both Bill and Peggy would be there, and that both Bill and Peggy had to die.
I appreciate you clarifying that, because I often wondered and hadn't asked if the date had any significance. If, a lot of times on a holiday weekend, and it was Memorial Day weekend 10 years ago, a lot of times on a holiday weekend, people are out of town, or they have events, or they're with other family members. And I wondered if the date had any significance to the person, and maybe not. It's just one of the things to look at. And it's interesting you mentioned, I wonder if your vision of what happened has changed looking back 10 years later, because, and you also mentioned people who watch, a lot of crime shows. I mean, all of us want to be armchair sleuths, and most of us are not good at it. And that's why there are people like you and Sergeant Adams and all of the other entities you named who work on cases like this. There's a fascinating article by this forensic psychologist named Catherine Ramsland, and it just came out this week. And she calls something WYSIATI, what you see is all there is. And that's what a lot of people tend to look at. And it's like as pieces of information come out, and absolutely law enforcement need to keep certain things to themselves, because that would be a way to prove if someone says something, whether they were actually there or if it's a rumor they heard from, the cleaning crew. It's important to keep those things back. We get it. And so when those of us who are sitting back and looking at a terrible event like this and thinking, well, I know what happened, or I can figure out what happened. We can't. But it also doesn't mean we don't have the information that might help you and the people who actually know what's going on. That's what we're hoping for, is that someone within the sound of our voice comes forward with something they find inconsequential. And I know that's happened to me over the last 9 or 10 months. I've gotten pieces of information that I was like, well, no, why would that be important? But I send it right to you, because it's not my judgment call to say whether it's important or not. And it may be something that hey, I need to look at this. And so I just want to say, and I know we're going to say it again at the end, anything that you think may not be important, it may be huge. And something Sheriff Helmig said right after the murders, he said, you may have heard something. Someone may have said something disparaging about Bill and Peggy, like they got what they deserve. If someone hears something like that, I hope that they would, even if it's just someone they think's a crank, who's just talking out, out of the side of their mouth. That kind of thing could be so important. So when you saw when you saw this scene, did it take long to realize that that it had to be an outsider? Like, if there's two people, and it's obviously, I don't know the details of the scene, did it dawn on anyone, or did anyone think immediately, we need to make sure this isn't like a murder-suicide? It's absolutely an outsider. Like, were there any weapons left?
Okay, so a couple of things. The outsider, that was kind of a lane shift there. Well, I'm not going to make a lot of comments on whether it was an outsider, or I guess the contrast of that would be an insider. I'm not going to make too many comments on that. I am going to drop back to something that you mentioned before when you asked, is there any significance with the date? And my answer to that is, I don't believe there's any significance to the date, with it being Memorial Day weekend, that kind of thing. I do believe there is a strong significance today. In other words, to the day of the week. Let me explain. So Bill and Peggy did the exact same thing on Sundays, every weekend of their life. Sometimes Peggy may not be able to go to church because of some medical issues that she had. But if she didn't have medical issues, they did the same thing. They were at church, they were at the chapel, then they were at church. So it's kind of, it just kind of jumps out at you that, okay, so did someone choose this particular day because they felt like, well, when they're not at church, someone from church or from the chapel is going to swing by and say, where's Bill? Because even though Peggy might not be able to come sometimes with her medical issues, it wasn't anything that was to the point to where Bill would have to stay home and actually take care of her or that kind of thing. So Bill would always show up.
So the date,
that's one thing
the
that
date
is
may
really
not be,
for us.
Yeah, the date may not be important, but the day of the week might be, because the person or persons wanted them found.
Correct. Wanted them to be found by someone else. And I'm not going to delve into that any further.
And quickly.
Even though you will try to get me to. But then the other thing that I wanted to say is, you had mentioned about, so when you started and there were things that you started looking at, all of the detectives involved, and there were a bunch, and a lot of people put in a lot of hard work. But so we're kind of tracking in the same lane that we were right from that weekend with our theories. And that's what is really important about Detective Adams, and he's really good about it, to keep me from getting tunnel vision and just keep going down that same lane. But we end up in that lane a lot, in the original lane, tracking some of the same things that we did early on in the case. So having done so and continuing to do so, that theory is actually gains a lot of Oh, not a lot of physical evidence, but a lot of circumstantial evidence that keeps keeping us in that lane.
Right.
And so I just felt like from something you said before that I probably needed to clear that up and make that important. Now, it's important that for two reasons. It's important that we take every piece of information that we get and every call that we get to say, hey, you may want to take a look at this person, that we do that. Number one, because it may be that other person or other persons. And then secondly, because this is the 10th year anniversary, and this is one of the hardest things that you will ever do as a law enforcement officer when you are entrusted with murder cases, because no one deserves answers more than the family of victims.
Absolutely.
And the only thing that allows us to sleep at night is to know that we are doing everything that we can. Every piece of information we follow up on, we are hammering that nail. You've heard me say that before. You just keep hitting the nail. And that's the only way that we can look at the family and say, we're doing everything that we can. And to know that, for them to know that we mean that. And actually it's a blessing with Bill and Peggy's children that they are Christians, and that certainly we know that this is in God's hands and in His timing. And as you spoke before and said, I just talked to someone the other day and they were talking about they went to school with Bill and how, what a great person he is and stuff like that. Their testimony is still being heard 10 years after their death. I don't know that you can name too many people outside of someone like Billy Graham or someone on that level that you could say something like that about. And that's pretty remarkable. And it's a testament to their lives. And maybe that's why God hasn't given us the answers in the case yet. So that's kind of where we are. I know I got off on a tangent there.
No,
but
that's
like
exactly
that should be said.
It's exactly where I wanted to go, actually, if you want to know the truth. So perhaps you're, reading my mind. So one of the things that struck me last year when I was speaking with a few of the family members was something that their son Doug said. And he said, all we have left is our parents' legacy. And I know that it means a lot to them. And I know they still continue to do the work that Bill and Peggy did, the work behind the scenes that, some people know about, some people don't. But they did so much for many communities. Not only were they beloved in their, home area in Boone County, they took many donations down to Eastern Kentucky to, and now apparently there was I don't know if it's rain or a flood, but so this areas that have been hit really hard, and the Stevenson kids still continue their parents' work. So there's no better legacy than passing on to your kids and their kids your work. And it's, here, like you said, 10 years later, you can't find someone who has a bad word to say about either of them, which is so, let's say they angered someone and someone keyed their car. We've heard about things like that. But to go to this level of just monstrosity is something, maybe one day we'll understand, maybe we won't. But so let's go over a few things because people send in questions to me. I can't imagine how many you get. But obviously this was not a robbery gone bad. Someone wasn't breaking in and got caught and they had to go to this great length to cover up nothing because there were items left that would have been of value or could have been of value if this was just a robbery, right?
That is correct. There were lots of things in the scene that we typically see taken in other burglaries that are actually, burglaries or robberies because they want to take something and turn it into quick cash to buy, whatever illicit drug or something illegal. But that you're correct. That is not something that is present in this case. It was not a robbery motivated crime.
So sometimes I get the terms confused. So I did look them up. So Burglary is, the definition of burglary is entering a building illegally with an intent to commit a crime, usually theft. A robbery is actually taking property unlawfully from a place or person by force or threat of force. So it wasn't just maybe someone breaking in to an older couple's home to see what they could get. It wasn't someone breaking into a couple's home. Hey, I hear they collect coins. I hear they have a giant safe buried under their refrigerator. It was nothing like that.
It wasn't anything like that. And so doing our victimology and looking at Bill and Peggy, Bill, if he was sitting here today and we weren't talking about his murder, let's say we were talking about material things, coins, but he would tell you without a doubt, if someone confronted me and put a gun in my face and said, give me everything you have, he would give them everything he had. Because
right.
It's like, that's not where his treasures are laid up. His treasures and Peggy's were truly laid up in heaven. So to think that, hey, somebody just broke in, they want to take some stuff, and Bill decided that he wasn't going to let him do that. So that doesn't even fit with him. So, plus the fact that those things that people would have taken, and knowing that they remained for quite some time after the murders were committed, they would have taken them. They had all the time in the world to take anything they wanted from that residence. So.
Well, it appeared that Bill and Peggy gave a lot away anyway. That was part of their DNA. It was part of their life to give away a lot of things, to donate. It wasn't, so I can't imagine for 1 second them being interrupted, interrupting a robbery, waking up or being awake and someone's trying to steal something. They would have handed it over and probably pointed to where other things were that they could take. I mean, I just don't see. Yeah. So as I do have to say this, as I was looking up in the Oxford Dictionary, burglary versus robbery, I thought I would my other favorite definition is for coy. So I don't know if your parents named you this specifically because it's a family name or whatever, but typically you think of it.
I'm shy.
Because you're shy. Typically it's like, it's a reference to a woman who's shy or modest. But do you know what my favorite definition of coy is? It's the second definition, and it's you. It's a reluctance to give details, especially about something regarded as sensitive. And literally there's a picture of you right next to it. It's like, this is coy. This is the definition of coy.
I've never even paid attention to that definition. That is ironic.
It's perfect.
Guilty.
It's perfect.
Guilty.
A reluctance to give details, especially about something regarded as sensitive. It is absolutely you. I was like, I have to look up coy because it's such an unusual, interesting name. But you, whether you knew it or not, or whether your parents knew it or not, they named you something absolutely perfect for what you do, because you are, so giving to people like me and, television stations, radio, newspaper, but you know the things that you need to withhold, and you keep those to preserve the case. And I don't want to give you a big head, but you do it masterfully. So I'm glad that you're the definition of coy, my friend. You are absolutely the definition of coy. So when we look at what in the hell this is about, which we don't know, this kind of stuff has been going on since Cain and Abel. People get something in their mind that they think someone else, needs to atone for. And it's really not, it's not their decision. So let's get to the new evidence or the new possibilities. You mentioned that there were 3 viable tips that came in last fall after quite a bit of media. And, I don't want to take credit with the podcast, but I'm awfully grateful to be in that pool of people that you spoke to. Really grateful to be in that pool. One of the tips that came in was from a witness who said, I wasn't sure I should mention this, but I'm going to mention this. And so why don't you go ahead and explain any part of that you want to explain?
So we early on actually the day of the murders and following after that, we were looking for a truck driver that possibly had been banging on the chapel door looking for Bill kind of frantically and just kind of unexplained because it didn't happen a lot. So there were several truck drivers that we ended up stopping all over the northern Kentucky, Cincinnati, tri-state area and beyond. And we had other agencies doing it as well if we could figure out that they had been at the truck stop during the previous couple of days prior to the murder. So we got this phone call as it related to a truck driver that the individual that had called in knew. And so we took that information, went through it, figured out who the individual was, made a comparison to the photograph that we had received that the image of a person was captured on the video camera in the truck stop. So we had a printed copy of that individual. And so when we compared, once we identified who this person was that we had the tip on, compared the photograph, and sure enough, it's kind of dead on it. So we were able to figure out that that individual lived or had moved shortly after the murders to a western state, which was kind of unusual, kind of just fell off the radar, one of the things that you look for. So then we got a pretty good break. There was an event in that person's life that brought them back to northern Kentucky, and we were able, my partner and I, Detective Adams, were able to meet with that individual, conduct an interview, and collect a DNA sample, which will be evaluated. It has already been sent to the Kentucky State Police Laboratory, and it will be evaluated there for comparison. So, and I've said as much as I can say about that.
Understood.
But you're free to ask any question you want. Just remember, my name is Coy.
It is absolutely Coy. You are the definition. It's capitalized. All letters capitalized, not just the C. You're the definition of Coy. So did this person willingly give you a DNA sample, or did you have to have a warrant?
The person was cooperative and voluntarily submitted, yes.
Okay. Do you believe, and not speaking of the person that you have the DNA of, but do you believe the person or persons who did this has done anything like this before or maybe since?
So we have no way of knowing that. Only thing that we can tell you is that that individual was not someone that had a profile in CODIS,
right,
meaning that they had not been convicted of a crime in a state where it provided that their DNA could be taken and entered into CODIS.
Right. I just was wondering if, as far as, MO by all the people that have, that know these things, that have seen the scene, if this is like, oh, this appears to not have been something that they just thought of late Saturday night. This appears to have been something that took some planning and some thought and potentially some experience, but maybe it's very focused on the Stevensons. So unless you have any other things that you want to make sure get out there, I just have one other question for you, but you can go ahead if there's anything else you feel like we haven't covered that you need to get out there.
Well, I think we've covered it. Obviously, I'm going to ask you at the end to make sure that the information for folks to get a hold of us if they do know anything, even if they think it is not something that is important. Please call us.
Absolutely. We have
email us. I know you have all those things, so that would be the last thing I would say. So go ahead with your question.
Well, we will have the number, the toll-free number, which is fantastic. You provide that, and the specific email address for the Stevensons only. It's not just info@. I will give you all that information. Correct. So my last question, and I thought about this a lot, and I understand you can't answer it, but I'm gonna ask you anyway, just from what you know, someone who knows this case probably better than anyone. So I'm like a very live and let live person, but it appears to me that someone who has the arrogance and the impudence to take another person's life feels like they are God. If it's not, we got in a fight, I punched a guy and he hit his head when he went down on a table and he died, that we can all figure that. We've heard those stories where someone punches someone directly in the chest and their heart stops. You didn't mean to kill him, but you did. This just feels so planned and so focused that the person or persons felt like they had some sort of righteous indignation or just plain selfishness, that they had the right to take someone else's life. So I'm going to ask you, do you think this person or persons has a belief system in something higher than themselves?
Well, I absolutely do. And I think, number one, any human being can rationalize anything that they find their little mind gets them into doing. This goes beyond that. I believe that the individual who did this believes that they did it with purpose and that they probably felt like it was something that they would interpret as being from God that they should do. Now, that gets pretty deep, and I'm not going to go any further with that, but I think to your point that somewhere between, we can all rationalize anything we do, even though we may realize at some point in time that it was wrong. But the reason I did it, it just kind of didn't work out the way I thought it was, but I did it for a good reason.
Right.
I think it goes beyond that, and it's somewhere between that and someone thinking that maybe because of their beliefs, they may have been scolded by someone who is a Christian person, such as Bill and Peggy would be, and maybe they were criticized for the way they'd done something, and that didn't go over real well. So maybe they thought that their beliefs were actually more in line with what God would want done, and maybe they were acting out to rid someone that disagreed with them, and therefore, in their minds, in the killer's mind, disagreed with God.
Well, that's a great answer. That's a better answer than I thought I would get. I thought you'd tell me to. Yeah, I thought you'd go tell me to go pound sand. So I'm grateful because I thought
the thing that I have to be careful of, and the thing that you have to be careful of when you're espousing my theories that I'm giving to you, is that last part that I just said, that's a theory. I mean, that could be wrong, but I get that strong feeling, that is a theory that we have to consider. And so,
it may not be the answer.
Those things do happen.
Right. It may not be the answer.
Right. But we can cite all kinds of historical cases where someone thought they were doing what God was telling them to do and acting under that umbrella when they do very heinous things.
Right.
Murder being the worst of all. But
right. That to me is a person who believes that they are God and that they have the right. And that's a great answer. That's a terrific answer, a very fleshed out.
Or that God speaks directly to them and tells them what to do. That's a different individual. And I will tell you that we have, in other cases and in this case, spoken to people who believe that.
Right. I'm quite sure. But I'll tell you.
And I think that through our relationship and through our study and through our prayer, we obviously ask God for things, and I believe that there are things and signs and stuff that happens that will kind of lead you to make your decision through prayer. But there are those people that also thinks that God comes and sits at the end of the bed and talks to them.
Right.
And I don't think we've seen that since the Old Testament times. Yeah. And
right.
So I think, when you run into those individuals, you really have to scratch your head and open up a whole new possibility for what that person is capable of.
Well, I'll tell you that something that brought everything home to me, no matter what I think of or what theories I have, is the beautiful, simple words from Bill and Peggy's granddaughter, Nicole. And at the end of an interview, 10 years ago, she said, there are human beings behind this story. And that's really the bottom line. These are human beings murdered by other human beings. God was not involved in this unless these other persons or people, their God is a different God. And these are human beings, and not only the human beings that are no longer with us, the human beings that are their family and friends, their wide circle of family and friends who have a piece of them missing. And we're smart enough to know that no matter what happens, we can't give them closure. When something like this happens, there's no closure. But what we can hope is that something happens, someone comes forward, and we can give them a little bit of peace. We can give them a little bit of peace back by knowing what happened and by who. So we really want to thank Detective Cox for talking with us again on this most awful of anniversaries 10 years later. And if you know something, we will leave the information at the end of this episode, and we can just ask you to look at your conscience and say, I should mention this. Thank you again, Detective Cox, for being here.
Thank you for keeping it out there, and I hope to hear from people soon.
So if you are listening to this podcast and you know about this case and what it has done to not just the family, but a community, to all of us, I ask that you please call or email the numbers we're going to give you. And there is a Bible verse that has brought me some hope over the last few weeks as I have worried and wondered about doing this update. And that is John chapter 14, verse 27. Peace is what I leave you with. It is my own peace that I give you. I do not give it as the world does. Do not be worried or upset. Do not be afraid. And if you know anything about this case, please don't be afraid. There's a $50,000 reward, which I hope that would not be the reason you would do this. But if it is, that's okay too. Please call the Boone County Sheriff's Department at 859-334-8496 or toll free at 844-210-1111 or email Stevenson Tip at BooneCountyKentucky.org. That's BooneCountyKY.org. And more cowbell.
If you'd like to support this podcast, go to patreon.com/justthetipsters.